Texas, December 1944. The first light of dawn spilled across the flat plains, touching the barbed wire and wooden barracks with a soft gold glow. Inside the camp's mess hall, the air was thick with a smell that didn't belong to war. Sizzling bacon. The sound of it popping on the griddle echoed across the quiet morning. For a few seconds, even the guards stopped talking. German prisoners of war filed inside, boots clattering on the wooden floor. Their uniforms were worn, their faces drawn and pale. They had been captured in France and shipped halfway around the world to a place they could barely imagine, Texas. Most expected punishment, maybe starvation. Instead, the smell of breakfast wrapped around them like something unreal. Behind the counter stood an American cook in a sweat-stained cowboy hat. He flipped eggs with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times. When the first prisoner reached the line, the cook smiled. "Mornin', partner," he said, sliding a plate forward. On it, scrambled eggs, toast, and 2 perfect strips of bacon. The German hesitated. He looked at the plate, then at the cook, waiting for the trick. The man behind him nudged him forward. The cook chuckled. "Ain't no poison in it. Go on, eat." The prisoner sat down at a long wooden table and stared. He hadn't seen real meat in months. When he finally took a bite, the crunch and salt hit him like a shock. For a moment, he forgot who he was: a soldier, a captive, an enemy. All he knew was that the food was warm, real, human. His eyes filled with tears. Across the room, others were silent. Some whispered that it was propaganda. Some prayed quietly. But most just ate, overwhelmed by something they didn't understand. That morning, no speeches were given. No orders shouted. The guards sipped coffee. The prisoners ate in near silence. The only sound, the clatter of tin forks and the hiss of bacon grease. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't even mercy. At least not in the usual sense. It was routine. Breakfast served by men who believed that decency didn't need permission. To the prisoners, that normality was more powerful than any act of force. One of them, a young mechanic from Dresden named Carl Weiss, wrote later, "That morning I tasted America. It was not sweet or bitter. It was honest." When breakfast ended, the men went back to their barracks under the wide Texas sky. But something in them had shifted. For the first time since capture, they weren't just prisoners of war. They were guests in a world that didn't match the one they'd been told to hate. They didn't know it yet, but that simple breakfast, bacon, eggs, and black coffee, was only the beginning of a lesson that would last long after the war was over. A few months before that breakfast in Texas, the same men were still soldiers. They had fought in Normandy and across the fields of France, believing what their officers told them, that America was weak, soft, and drowning in its own luxury. Then came defeat. Their unit was surrounded, their weapons gone, their uniforms torn. They expected the usual fate of prisoners in wartime: hunger, humiliation, maybe worse. Instead, the Americans gave them cigarettes, water, and cans of meat. That first surprise set the tone for everything that followed. The captured Germans were loaded onto trucks, then trains, then massive Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic. When they reached New York Harbor, they pressed against the rails, staring in disbelief. There were no ruins, no bombed-out buildings, no hungry crowds. The skyline shimmered, glass, steel, motion. The docks overflowed with crates of food, cars, and machines. America wasn't suffering from war. It was thriving because of it. From there, the trains carried them south. For days, they looked out at a country that seemed endless. Forests, plains, and towns untouched by bombs. In one small town, children waved as the train rolled by. Some of the prisoners waved back before they remembered they weren't supposed to. When the trains finally reached Texas, the men could hardly believe what they saw. The land stretched forever. Golden grass, windmills, and cattle herds like moving clouds. The guards laughed and said, "Welcome to God's country." The prisoners weren't sure whether to be scared or amazed. Their new home was Camp Hearn, one of dozens of POW camps across the state. By 1945, nearly 50,000 Germans were held in Texas. Alone, spread between big bases and small ranch outposts, it was part of a massive wartime system. Over 400,000 Axis soldiers held in camps across the United States. But these weren't the brutal compounds they'd imagined. The U.S. followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. The prisoners were given medical care, mail from home, and 3 full meals a day, sometimes more food than they'd had as soldiers. Their rations matched those of American troops. About 3,200 calories daily. Meat, potatoes, bread, milk. For men who had survived on black bread and thin soup, it was almost confusing. One guard put it simply, "We feed you because we can." It wasn't arrogance, it was confidence. The United States didn't need to starve its enemies to prove its power. It just needed to show them how ordinary life worked in a country that wasn't falling apart. And so thousands of German soldiers found themselves in the most unexpected classroom imaginable, learning about America, not from propaganda or politics, but from breakfast tables, fair treatment, and the quiet efficiency of a system that never stopped running. Soon they would step beyond the camp's fences and meet the people who embodied that system, the ranchers, farmers, and cowboys who would change their understanding of freedom forever. The first time the German prisoners saw a Texas ranch, they thought it was a mirage. The sky stretched endlessly. The land shimmered with heat, and cattle dotted the horizon like slow-moving shadows. They'd been assigned to help local ranchers, not to punish them, but because the war had drained the state of manpower. With so many American men overseas, someone had to keep the ranches running. When the truck stopped, a man in a straw hat and dusty boots greeted them. "Morning, boys," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I'm Jack. You work hard, you eat well. That's the deal." The Germans exchanged puzzled looks. Was this some kind of test? But the rancher's smile didn't fade. Let's get to it. The prisoners were nervous. They knew how to march and obey orders, but not how to mend fences or herd cattle. Their first day was chaos. One man broke a post. Another dropped an entire bucket of nails into the dirt. The cowboys laughed, not cruelly, just amused. They showed the Germans how to hold a hammer properly, how to tie a rope, how to stay calm when a steer charged. "You gotta work with the animal, not against it," one cowboy said. By the second week, something shifted. The prisoners began to find rhythm in the work. The sun rose, the cattle moved, and the day passed in sweat and dust. Their hands toughened, their posture relaxed. They learned words like fence line, shoot, and lasso. They even started teasing each other in broken English and German Texan slang. At lunchtime, the rancher's wife brought sandwiches and coffee, sometimes cold Coca-Cola in sweating glass bottles. Most of the Germans had never tasted soda before. The first sip drew laughter and disbelief. "It tastes like electricity," one man shouted, and the cowboys nearly spit out their coffee laughing. What began as labor turned into something more human. The prisoners started asking questions about the land, about America, about why the cowboys worked so hard. The answers were simple. "Because it's ours," one cowboy said. That idea stuck. Ownership, pride without orders. One afternoon, a young cowboy named Tom noticed a prisoner staring at his horse. You would have a ride?" he asked. The German shook his head. "Not unless you count tanks," he said, smiling. Tom grinned. "Well, this one kicks less, if you're lucky." Within minutes, the cowboy was showing him how to mount, how to grip with his knees, how to trust the animal. The rest of the men watched, laughing, cheering, clapping when he finally stayed on for more than 10 seconds. That evening, back at camp, the same German sat quietly, still grinning. "I think I rode America today," he said to his bunkmate. The change didn't happen all at once, but every day the line between captor and captive faded a little more. The cowboys respected hard work, not uniforms. The prisoners responded to fairness, not fear. Slowly, they began to realize that the true power of this place wasn't in its fences or rifles. It was in the calm confidence of people who didn't need cruelty to prove strength. In the evenings, as the sun sank over the fields, the guards sometimes brought out guitars. Cowboys sang country songs. The Germans answered with old folk tunes. The music mixed in the warm night air, two worlds blending into one quiet harmony. By the end of that summer, even the locals had a nickname for them: the German Cowboys. What started as captivity had become something stranger and deeper, a lesson about dignity, decency, and the kind of freedom that can't be ordered, only earned. By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end, though the men in Texas didn't know exactly how close. Days on the ranch still started before sunrise, feeding cattle, hauling hay, fixing fences. The work had become routine, almost peaceful. The guards had relaxed too. Their rifles hung more loosely on their shoulders. Their voices had lost the edge of suspicion. Trust had grown, quietly, like grass through dust. Then came that morning, the one no one forgot. It began with a sound, not a sight, the crackle of grease on a hot griddle. Then the smell drifted through the camp, thick, smoky, unmistakable. Bacon. The prisoners looked at each other in disbelief. Bacon wasn't for them. It was for Americans, for the victors. They lined up slowly outside the mess hall, expecting some kind of mistake. Inside, the cook, the same cowboy in a stained apron and weathered hat, flipped eggs and hummed a tune. "Morning, boys," he called. "You're getting the good stuff today." Carl Weiss, the mechanic from Dresden, stepped forward. The cook handed him a plate piled with eggs, bread, and 2 golden strips of bacon still sizzling. Carl hesitated. The cook nodded toward the table. "Go on, partner, it's real." The first bite hit like memory: salt, smoke, warmth. Then something else: emotion. Carl blinked hard, trying not to cry. Around him, other men ate slowly, unsure what to say. The guards sat among them this time, drinking coffee, chatting about baseball scores and home. No one used the word enemy. Halfway through breakfast, someone began to laugh, not mockingly, but softly, like a man waking from a long bad dream. Another guard joined in, passing a can of syrup down the table. The sound spread, awkward at first, then natural. For a few minutes, the camp sounded like any other dining hall in America. Clinking plates, conversation, human noise. One prisoner whispered, "Why would they feed us like this?" His friend answered, "Because they can afford to." It wasn't arrogance. It was truth. In a war built on scarcity, America's abundance was its quiet weapon. After breakfast, a few prisoners lingered, helping to clean up. Carl thanked the cook in broken English. The man just smiled. "Ain't no trouble. Everybody deserves breakfast." Outside, the Texas sky was wide and cloudless. Somewhere far away, the Reich was collapsing. Dresden, Carl's home, was already in ruins, though he didn't know it yet. Inside the camp, however, the war felt distant. Here, there was no hatred, no speeches, no orders, just bacon, coffee, and the strange relief of being treated like a man again. That night, Carl sat by the fence, writing in his notebook. "This morning, they fed us bacon," he wrote. "I thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. They broke us, not with guns, but with kindness. I think this is what defeat really means. To see your enemy feed you better than your own country ever did." The guards turned off the lights one by one. The camp fell quiet except for the low murmur of crickets and the distant hum of a ranch truck heading home. The next day, rumors spread. Germany was losing cities. The war was almost over. The bacon breakfast had been more than a meal. It was a farewell, a wordless gesture that said, "You've survived. You're going home soon." But for men like Carl, home would never mean the same thing again. A few weeks after that breakfast, the war in Europe ended. News arrived not through explosions or orders, but through a radio crackling in the mess hall. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The men froze. Some stared at the floor, others at nothing at all. For years, every breath, every thought had revolved around that war, and now, in one sentence, it was gone. The guards didn't celebrate. They simply stood quietly, hats in hand. Later that night, one of them turned on a country station, and the sound of soft music drifted across the camp. It wasn't triumph, it was relief. A few days later, Red Cross trucks rolled in, bringing mail from home. For many prisoners, it was the first letter in months. Carl received one written in shaky handwriting. "We are alive. Dresden is gone, but we are alive. American soldiers brought us food." Imagine that. Americans feeding Germans. Carl read the letter twice, then folded it slowly, his hands trembling. Around him, other men cried or smiled through tears. It wasn't just news from home. It was proof that humanity still existed on both sides of the war. Life in the camp grew quieter after that. Guards began calling the men by name instead of number. Prisoners helped fix fences without being asked. The fear that had once filled the air was gone. There was only waiting to go home to a country they barely recognized. Then came one final surprise. The cook, the same cowboy who had served them bacon months before, announced there would be a farewell breakfast. "One last meal before y'all head out," he said, his drawl easy and warm. Not as prisoners, as folks. That morning, the mess hall smelled like home. Bacon, eggs, biscuits, and coffee. The tables were decorated with checkered cloths, and someone had pinned a small American flag and beside it, a clean German one. The men filed in silently, unsure what to feel. The cook raised his cup. "We had our differences," he said, "but you worked hard and you kept your word. That counts for something." He smiled. "So let's eat together like free men." Applause started softly, then filled the room. The guards sat beside the prisoners, sharing coffee, swapping stories about farms, wives, and weather. A radio in the corner played "Don't Fence Me In." Some of the Germans hummed along, their accents thick but sincere. For the first time, the camp didn't feel like a camp. It felt like a place of peace. When breakfast ended, the guards handed each man an envelope and a pen. "Write home," they said. "Tell them you're coming." Carl stared at the blank page for a long time before writing. "Dear Mother, I am alive. America is not what we were told. They did not hate us. They fed us, taught us, and let us work. I have learned something here. Power is not in fear or cruelty. It's in kindness. They defeated us with breakfast, not bullets. He folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. Later that day, as the trucks lined up to take the men away, the cook tore a piece from the red and white tablecloth and handed it to Carl. "Something to remember Texas by," he said. Carl nodded, too moved to speak. The trucks rumbled to life, dust rising behind them. Through the slats, the men waved, not as prisoners, but as changed men. As the camp faded into the distance, Carl looked at the cloth in his hands. It smelled faintly of smoke and coffee. He smiled. "They didn't just feed us," he whispered. "They showed us what freedom looks like." And somewhere back in Texas, that same cowboy poured himself another cup of coffee, looked out over the sunrise, and said softly, "Those boys will be all right." June 1943. The war is raging in Europe, but here, in Norfolk, Virginia, the morning air smells of salt and diesel. A ship from North Africa docks quietly. Down the ramp walk hundreds of German prisoners, young, tired, expecting hate. Hermann Butcher, a Wehrmacht officer, blinks at what he sees. White and black dock workers move cranes together, shouting instructions over the noise. Women in overalls drive trucks. Teenagers sell newspapers. Nobody hides. Nobody spits at them. For 3 years, German soldiers were told America was chaotic, weak, run by women and minorities. Yet the chaos they see now feels organized, confident. But cranes swing in rhythm. Ants play at a war bond rally nearby. Vendors sell coffee right next to battleships. Life keeps going as if the war were happening somewhere far away. Butcher whispers to the man behind him, "The Americans are insane." But what he means is, none of this makes sense. In Germany, civilians near a military base would be controlled, inspected, silenced. Here, they wander freely. Even the guards look relaxed. The Norfolk base itself is a city of motion. Thousands of workers, ships unloading supplies, music drifting from loudspeakers. The Germans are stunned not by the size, but by the attitude. This is a country at war that doesn't act afraid. As they line up for processing, an American officer addresses them in fluent German and reads their rights from the Geneva Convention. Rights. The word sounds absurd to men who have seen prisoners shot for slowing down on a march. The officer asks about dietary needs, medical issues, religion. Some laugh nervously, waiting for the trick, but there isn't one. Then come the medics, some of them black, some Jewish. They check wounds, give injections, write notes. One technician, a young African American, calmly draws blood from a German lieutenant. The man freezes, unsure if he should refuse. Back home, this would be illegal. Here, it's routine. Later, they are led to a mess hall where American sailors eat lunch. Enemies, the ones who had been firing torpedoes at each other weeks ago, now share one roof, the same food. The Americans don't stare. They talk about baseball. For the prisoners, this calm normalcy is the strangest thing of all. They had expected cages and humiliation. Instead, they walk through a place that looks impossibly like the future. What begins here on this ordinary dock is more than captivity. It's the first crack in a worldview built on fear and obedience. The German prisoners expected the worst: barbed wire, barking guards, hunger. Instead, the first thing they heard was an American officer explaining rules, politely, in clear German, and quoting the Geneva Convention. It felt unreal. In their army, prisoners were either labor tools or problems to get rid of. Here, they were treated like people. When medics arrived, the confusion deepened. They carried real medicine: penicillin, still rare even for German officers at the front. One wounded soldier was treated by a Jewish American nurse. He didn't know whether to thank her or look away. Back home, everything about that moment would have been impossible. Here, it was normal. Meals came next. Instead of guards tossing food through a fence, they were led into a clean hall with long tables. At one end, American sailors ate lunch. At the other, the Germans. Same menu, same trays. Nobody shouted. The only sound was a radio broadcasting a baseball game. To the prisoners, that mix of enemies and normal life felt more shocking than defeat itself. After processing, they boarded trains heading west, not in boxcars, but in passenger coaches with windows and soft seats. Civilians waved from the platforms, not angrily, just curious. At one station, a farmer handed an apple to a guard and said, "For your Germans." The officer smiled and passed it through the window. The prisoners looked out as the landscape rolled by. Open fields, small towns, factories running full speed. Nothing was hidden. In Germany, military zones were covered, secret, guarded. Here, you could read the factory names in giant letters. Cars filled the parking lots. Workers' homes had gardens, electric lights, radios on the porches. One officer noticed a worker toss half an apple and open a new one. Waste. Casual, thoughtless, but free. It hit harder than any propaganda. These Americans didn't fear shortage. They didn't fear their leaders. They didn't fear anything. By the time the train reached Texas, the prisoners were silent. They'd seen too much to fit into their old beliefs. America wasn't just rich. It was confident in a way they couldn't explain. It didn't need to prove its power by cruelty. It proved it by calm. And as the train slowed near their first camp, a strange question spread among them. If the enemy treats us like this, what else have we been wrong about? The trip to Texas took 3 days. For the German prisoners, every mile felt like another riddle. They were crossing the land of their enemy, yet nothing looked like a country at war. Factories worked at full speed, but with no fences or camouflage. Company names were painted in giant letters. Workers came and went freely, carrying lunchboxes, chatting, laughing. In Germany, that would be considered a security risk. Here, it was everyday life. At one stop, in Pennsylvania, the prisoners saw men leaving a steel mill. Each one wore clean clothes, leather shoes, and a wristwatch. Small details that felt impossible back home. They noticed a worker throw away a half-eaten sandwich and open another one. To men who had fought over scraps in Africa, that simple gesture was hard to process. Waste wasn't just waste, it was a symbol of abundance. When the train paused in Washington, D.C., families gathered to see off American soldiers. Wives kissed their husbands in public. Children waved flags. Teenagers shared milkshakes at the station cafe. Just a few feet away, German prisoners watched through the windows. No one cursed them. No one even seemed to care. For the first time, they saw a society at war without fear. People criticized the government openly in newspapers. Civilians wandered near trains filled with enemy soldiers. There was no sense of panic, no police patrols shouting orders. To the prisoners, it looked like a kind of strength they had never imagined. Confidence built on freedom, not control. As the train rolled south, the landscape changed. Farmland, small towns, endless sky. Even the poorhouses had electricity and radios. One prisoner pointed out that in Germany, only officers could afford such comfort. Another muttered, when they crossed into Texas, guards told them the name of their destination, Camp Hearn. The prisoners laughed at first. A camp in the middle of nowhere? What could it be? But looking out the window, they saw fields, tractors, roads filled with trucks. America's war machine wasn't just in factories. It was in the soil, the rhythm, the ordinary life around them. The thought settled quietly among them. If this is how the enemy lives, then maybe the war was never about strength at all. Maybe it was about ideas. When the prisoners arrived at Camp Hearn, Texas, they braced for punishment. Instead, they walked into something that felt more like a college campus than a prison. Wooden barracks with electric lights, hot showers, real beds with sheets, a library, even a small store where they could buy chocolate, cigarettes, and soap using camp money they earned from work. It didn't make sense. In Germany, prisoners were barely fed. Here, they could shop, and they could work, not as slaves, but as laborers on Texas farms, cotton gins, and ranches. The pay was small, but the respect was real. Farmers talked to them, argued with them, even joked. Some complained about President Roosevelt right in front of them. No one got arrested. That alone felt like science fiction. At the King Ranch, the Germans saw something else they couldn't explain. White, black, and Mexican workers sharing the same tasks. Not equal in status, not yet, but working side by side. The racial order they'd been taught their whole lives didn't fit this picture. And when a black man outpicked them in the cotton field, the shock was personal. Inside the camp, life kept surprising them. Women ran trucks, stores, and offices. Female pilots flew over the base from a nearby airfield. For men raised to see women as helpers, not leaders, it was another broken rule. Then came Christmas. Local families donated gifts, candy, cards, small presents for every German prisoner. American mothers whose sons were fighting in Europe baked cookies for their enemies. The town choir learned German carols and sang inside the camp. Some prisoners cried quietly in the back rows, unable to understand why kindness came from the other side of the war. That night, the camp glowed with electric lights strung across the yard, brighter than most German towns even before the war. For the first time, many of them didn't feel like prisoners. They felt seen. None of it was meant as propaganda. It was just how Americans lived. Messy, loud, generous. But for men raised under orders to fear and hate, this simple normalcy was more powerful than any speech. And somewhere in that Texas night, behind barbed wire that didn't feel like a cage, the first real change began. By early 1944, Camp Hearn had turned into something no one expected: a school. Not officially, but in spirit. The prisoners started classes in English, history, math, and farming. Books came from local donations and the American Library Association. Many were banned in Germany. Works by Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, even Jewish authors. Reading them wasn't rebellion anymore. It was freedom, quietly learned behind barbed wire. Some prisoners signed up for correspondence courses from Texas colleges. Others drew, painted, or played in the camp orchestra. For the first time, they had choices, something dictatorship never allowed. American officers didn't lecture them about democracy. They just let them live inside it. The re-education program was simple: show, don't preach. Guards treated them fairly. They could argue about politics without fear. They could read newspapers that criticized the government and still see the country function. That experience, disagreement without punishment, confused them at first, then fascinated them. Over time, change showed in small ways. Fewer Nazi symbols on walls, more English in conversations, letters home describing Americans not as monsters, but as strange, open people. The camp newspaper, once full of slogans, started printing essays about freedom and justice. No one forced them to write that. It just happened. When the war ended, Most expected to go home unchanged. But something had shifted. They had seen a different kind of strength, one built on trust and opportunity, not fear. Back in Germany, many helped rebuild cities, open schools, and start businesses modeled on what they'd seen in Texas fields and factories. Some returned as allies. A few even came back to America for good, working as engineers, teachers, or farmers. They carried no medals, no victory flags, just a new understanding of what power could mean. The story of those men is easy to miss because it happened quietly, without battle cries or headlines. But it may be one of America's greatest victories, showing that freedom itself can change minds faster than force ever could. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and check out more true tales of history that remind us how humanity, even in war, can surprise us all. Texas, 1944. The sun was barely up when the truck stopped outside Amarillo. The engines went quiet, and for a moment, all that could be heard was the wind and the soft rattle of dry grass. Inside the back of one truck sat 20 German women, nurses, clerks, and radio operators from the defeated Luftwaffe. Their uniforms were wrinkled, their faces gray with dust and fear. For weeks, they'd been moved across oceans and borders, told the same thing by guards and rumors alike. America was a nightmare. They'd be chained, starved, or worse. Some whispered that American soldiers shot prisoners on sight. Others swore their captured women were sent to work camps or never heard from again. When the truck doors opened, 24-year-old Lieselot Meinhardt braced herself for shouting and rifles. Instead, she saw a man in a tan hat and dusty boots. No helmet, no gun pointed at her. "Ma'am," he said softly, "watch your step." His voice carried a lazy drawl, so calm it felt unreal. Outside, the air smelled of hay, not smoke. Horses snorted nearby. A dog barked once and ran off into the heat haze. The sky stretched so wide it seemed to have no end. A kind of freedom that almost hurt to look at. Lieselot stepped down slowly, expecting a blow at any moment. But none came. The man in the hat handed her a tin cup filled with cold water. She hesitated, then drank. It was clean, crisp, the best thing she'd tasted in months. He smiled and said, "Plenty more where that came from." Behind her, the other women climbed out, blinking in disbelief. There were guards, yes, a few soldiers standing nearby with rifles slung loosely at their sides, but no barking dogs, no chains, no hatred. Only quiet efficiency. One of the Texans pointed toward a line of low wooden buildings beyond the fence. "You'll be staying there," he said. "Breakfast in an hour." Breakfast. The word barely made sense. Lieselot looked around, at the fences that didn't seem high enough to keep anyone in, at the men who seemed more like farmhands than guards, and whispered to the woman beside her, "This is America?" For 3 years, she had been told it was a land of greed and chaos. But here, under the open Texas sky, she saw something else entirely. A country so sure of itself that it didn't need to hate its enemies. That first morning in camp, the women waited for the cruelty to start. None of them spoke as American soldiers handed out metal trays and lined them up for breakfast. They braced for insults or thin soup. Instead, they got coffee, scrambled eggs, bread, and even apple pie. It looked like a joke, too generous to be real. One woman whispered that it might be poisoned, but hunger is stronger than fear. They ate in silence and waited to be punished. Nothing happened. Later, an officer came to explain the rules. He didn't shout. He spoke slow, in clear German. The United States, he said, followed the Geneva Convention. Prisoners would work, get paid, write letters, and be treated fairly. If they obeyed orders, they would be safe. The women stared at him, trying to understand the point of such an act. In their world, kindness from a victor didn't exist. America's approach wasn't built on mercy. It was built on order. By 1944, the U.S. was holding more than 400,000 prisoners of war, most of them German. The War Department had learned something simple. A prisoner who's well-fed, busy, and treated decently causes no trouble. Fewer guards, fewer escapes. But to the women, who'd grown up in a system where fear was law, this logic felt like compassion. Each day followed a rhythm: roll call, meals, work details, mail delivery. They were allowed to attend church, use the library, and take English lessons. Medical care was provided by Army doctors. The rations were the same as those given to American soldiers: beef, potatoes, bread, vegetables. Even coffee when supplies allowed. At night, the women wrote letters home. Most began the same way: "I am alive, do not worry." But what came next was harder to explain. They wanted to tell their families that they were being treated with respect, that guards said please and thank you, that no one yelled, that the food was good. But such words sounded impossible, even to them. When the letters were sent through Red Cross channels, most families refused to believe them. Back in Germany, people lived on rations and fear. The idea that prisoners were being treated with decency in America felt like fantasy. For the women in Texas, though, it was very real. The fear of the first days began to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar: curiosity. If this was how America treated its enemies, what did that say about everything they'd been told? By midsummer, the camp gates opened for a new kind of assignment. The women were told they'd be sent to work on nearby ranches. They imagined hard labor under armed watch, maybe even chains. But when the trucks stopped outside a wide stretch of land near Austin, what they saw looked like something out of a movie. Horses grazing, barns painted red, and men in denim shirts leaning on pickup trucks. Their new overseer wasn't a soldier. He was a rancher named Frank Callahan, tall, sunburned, with a grin that seemed impossible during wartime. "Morning, ladies," he said, tipping his hat. "You all ready to work?" The translator had to repeat the words twice before they believed him. The day started with breakfast: bacon, eggs, and coffee that could wake the dead. They ate at a long table while the ranch hands joked around them. No guards hovered nearby. When they finished, Frank clapped his hands once. "All right," he said, "let's get you riding." At first they thought he was joking. Riding? Prisoners? But minutes later, they stood by a corral full of saddled horses. The cowboys helped them up, laughing gently as skirts tangled and boots slipped. One woman screamed when her horse began to trot. Another froze in place, clinging to the reins. "Don't fight her," a cowboy said softly. "Just move with her." By noon, they were covered in dust and sweat, but something had changed. They were laughing. The fear that had followed them from Europe began to melt under the Texas sun. That night, after a long day of work, the women sat by a campfire with the ranch hands. Someone brought out a harmonica, another a guitar. The tune was familiar: Lily Marlene, a song every German soldier knew. Without thinking, one of the women began to sing. Then another joined in. Soon the voices blended, German and English, soft and warm in the night air. For a few minutes, there were no prisoners or guards, no sides, no war, just people, dust, and music under a sky full of stars. As the fire burned low, Frank said quietly, "War ends quicker when folks remember they're still people." The women didn't answer. They didn't know what to say. But inside, something settled. A quiet recognition that dignity could survive even here, in the middle of Texas, surrounded by strangers who refused to act like enemies. Days turned into weeks, and the ranch began to feel less like a prison and more like a small town with its own rhythm. The women worked hard, feeding animals, fixing fences, washing clothes, helping in the kitchen. There were no towers, no searchlights, just open land, windmills, and the steady hum of life. Frank Callahan made the rules simple. You run, he said. You'll die thirsty out there. You stay, you'll eat well and sleep easy. No one tried to escape. Why would they? Out here, surrounded by endless sky, they were trusted. For women who had spent their lives under orders, that trust felt unreal. The cowboys treated them like new hands, not like prisoners. They joked, teased, and taught them how to throw hay bales, mend saddles, and rope calves. Tougher than half the boys we've hired, one cowboy said, half proud, half amazed. Work wasn't punishment here. It was pride. They learned that in America, labor could be something to enjoy, not fear. One afternoon, a storm swept across the plains. The wind howled, lightning split the sky, and the cattle panicked. Without waiting for orders, the women grabbed ropes and joined the cowboys in the mud and rain, shouting, chasing, driving the herd back to safety. Hours later, soaked and shivering, they returned, exhausted but grinning. Not one animal lost. That night, Frank hammered up a hand-painted sign above their bunkhouse door, "The German Cowgirls." The women laughed until tears ran down their faces. For the first time since capture, they belonged somewhere. Evenings became something to look forward to. The ranch hands built fires, played music, and shared food. The women learned new words: howdy, y'all, partner. They tried Coca-Cola for the first time, wrinkling their noses at the sweetness, then asking for more. There was still war, still loss, but here, far from Europe, it seemed distant, like a dream fading in the heat. Lieselot wrote in her journal, "They treat us as people, not prisoners. It is madness, but also something better than reason. Maybe kindness disguised as madness." Under the wide Texas sky, boundaries blurred. The women no longer felt like enemies. They were workers, riders, and strangely, a little bit free. Spring, 1945. The air on the Texas plains smelled of rain and new grass. Rumors spread quietly through the ranch. The war in Europe was ending. One afternoon, Frank Callahan walked out of the barn holding a folded newspaper. He took off his hat and said simply, "It's over." For a moment, no one spoke. The German women stood still, their hands frozen around tools and ropes. Some cried. Others just stared at the ground. They should have felt relief, but all they felt was emptiness. The war had taken everything: homes, families, certainty. What did home even mean now? Frank poured coffee for everyone and said, "You'll be going back soon." The word back hit harder than the news itself. Back to what? Germany was in ruins. Yet there was no anger in his voice, no victory. Just quiet understanding. When the trucks came, the women packed the few things they owned: letters, gloves, a few trinkets. Frank walked up to Lieselot, handed her a small wrapped bundle, and said, "So you don't forget Texas." Inside was a cream-colored Stetson hat. She laughed through tears as the cowboys cheered and waved them goodbye. Months later, when she stepped off a ship in Germany, the sight was almost unbearable. The docks were rubble, the cities gray and silent. American soldiers handed out food parcels: chocolate, canned milk, soap. On each box was the Red Cross emblem. Lieselot held her hat close and whispered, "They were right. America is not what they said." She began working as a translator for the Allied forces, her English rough and full of Texas slang. When she said "ain't," officers smiled. In 1948, she spoke at a women's conference in Stuttgart. "Freedom," she said, "isn't something nations give. It's something people show, one act of kindness at a time." Years later, she moved back to Texas and opened a small bakery in San Antonio. Above the counter hung a photo of her younger self wearing the cowboy hat, standing beside Frank. The caption read, "From enemies to friends." Visitors often asked if the story was real. She would smile and say, "It was more than real. It was human." If you believe kindness can change history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out more stories that prove humanity always finds a way. June 1943. A gray transport ship slides into Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. After 2 weeks at sea, hundreds of German prisoners lean over the railings, expecting punishment. They imagine barbed wire, barking guards, hard labor. Instead, the first thing they see is music. A brass band plays swing near the pier. Dock workers, white and black, move side by side, shouting to each other over the cranes. A woman in overalls operates a winch. Kids sell newspapers outside the gates. Nobody hides, nobody stares, and nobody seems afraid of them. Sergeant Hermann Buther, an officer from Rommel's Afrika Korps, writes later in his memoir that this was the first moment he felt confused, not captured. His world had been built on Nazi rules, on race, hierarchy, control. Yet here, those rules didn't seem to exist. Norfolk was the largest naval base on Earth, more than 4,000 acres of docks and warehouses. In one morning, it handled more cargo than Hamburg did in a week. But for the prisoners, the shock wasn't the size of the port. It was the freedom around it. Civilians walked near warships. Vendors sold coffee and donuts within sight of destroyers. The military seemed relaxed, almost casual, as if victory was already guaranteed. When the Germans were processed, another surprise came. American officers spoke to them in fluent German, reading out the Geneva Convention. They explained prisoners' rights, food rations, medical care, even religious diets. Some Jewish American soldiers distributed Red Cross packages and offered kosher meals for any Jewish POWs. The Germans laughed at first, thinking it was a cruel joke. It wasn't. The Americans were serious. Medical staff, including black technicians, treated German soldiers with the same new medicine, penicillin, that was still rare in Europe. To men trained to see race as destiny, this simple act of equality broke logic. In Germany, such contact would have been illegal. In America, it was just normal procedure. Their first meal on U.S. soil deepened the confusion. They were led into a mess hall where American sailors were already eating. Enemies who had tried to kill each other at sea now shared the same food line. The Americans barely looked up, too busy listening to a baseball game on the radio. For Butcher and the others, the message was silent but clear. This country wasn't trembling in war. It was living, loudly, freely, without fear. The shock wasn't in what they suffered, but in what they saw. A nation strong enough to be kind. The train rolled west through summer heat. Instead of dark boxcars, the German prisoners sat in real passenger coaches with soft seats and open windows. Guards walked the aisles calmly. No one shouted. At every stop, curious civilians gathered to watch. Kids waved. Women brought coffee. Some people even took photos. The Germans looked out the windows, stunned. America wasn't hiding its war machine. Factories stood in plain sight, names painted in giant letters. Glenn L. Martin Aircraft, Alcoa, Bethlehem Steel. Parking lots were full of workers' cars. From the train, the prisoners could see rows of shiny new planes waiting for delivery. No camouflage, no secrecy, just open confidence. At one stop, in Washington, D.C., families crowded the platform to say goodbye to sons heading to training camps. Wives kissed soldiers openly. Teenagers shared milkshakes at the station diner. On the same platform, behind a few guards, stood the enemy, German soldiers, watching a scene that would have been impossible in their own country. In Nazi Germany, the state owned fear. Citizens whispered their opinions and trusted no one. Here, the prisoners heard farmers and factory workers complain about President Roosevelt right out loud, and nobody arrested them. Newspapers sold at the stations carried headlines that criticized the government, argued about strategy, even questioned how the war was being fought. The Germans didn't understand how a country could fight a global war and still allow disagreement. But that, more than anything, was America's strength, chaos that somehow worked. As the train moved through Pennsylvania, the prisoners saw the glow of steel mills lighting up the night sky. They passed neighborhoods of small houses, each with gardens, cars, radios, electric lights in every window. In Germany, most homes had been darkened for years under blackout orders. Here, the light never stopped. One memory stuck with many prisoners. At a station stop, they watched a factory worker finish half an apple, toss it away, and open a new one. The waste seemed unthinkable. In North Africa, men had fought over crumbs. Now they watched an ordinary American throw food away without a thought. By the time they reached Texas, the shock had settled into silence. They hadn't been beaten, humiliated, or starved. Instead, they had been allowed to see, to really see, a country that didn't need walls or fear to protect itself. For men trained to believe that freedom led to weakness, this was the most dangerous thing America could have shown them. Freedom that worked. When the Germans arrived in Central Texas, they braced for the worst. They expected hard labor, tents, and punishment. Instead, they stepped into a camp with wooden barracks, electric lights, and hot water. Every building had flush toilets, clean sheets, and working showers. It wasn't luxury, but it was far beyond what most of them had even at home. Camp Hearn sat near a small town halfway between Houston and Dallas. It covered more than 700 acres and housed nearly 5,000 prisoners. Each man had a bed, a locker, and enough space to walk freely inside the compound. The rules were strict, but the tone was surprisingly human. The camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, spoke fluent German. He explained that prisoners would elect their own representatives, organize sports, and manage daily schedules. That single announcement, self-government for enemies, left many speechless. Soon, life in the camp began to look less like a prison and more like a small town. There was a library, a recreation hall, and even a stage for concerts. American teachers from nearby colleges gave lectures on agriculture, math, and English. The camp newspaper, written in German, started out filled with Nazi slogans, but slowly turned into open discussions about democracy and life after the war. The canteen became the most unbelievable sight of all. Prisoners could buy chocolate, cigarettes, and art supplies using tokens they earned from voluntary labor. They even painted, played ping pong, and built small model airplanes from scrap wood. Outside the camp, Texas farms and factories were desperate for workers. German POWs picked cotton, repaired fences, and worked at oil mills and canneries. They earned 80 cents a day, the same pay as an American private. Working side by side with Mexican American and black laborers, they saw a kind of racial cooperation that Nazi propaganda had called impossible. And then came Christmas. the entire town of Herne decided to give the prisoners a holiday celebration. Local churches sent food and gifts. School children wrote cards in German. One American mother, whose son was fighting in Italy, led her church choir in singing Silent Night for the enemy soldiers. That evening, under a 30-foot Christmas tree covered in electric lights, hundreds of men stood quietly, holding small wrapped presents. Many cried. Some prayed. For the first time, they felt that kindness could be stronger than victory. Camp Herne wasn't meant to punish them. It was meant to show them what freedom looked like in simple, ordinary ways. And that lesson was starting to take root. At Camp Herne, daily life kept challenging everything the German prisoners thought they knew about power and fairness. They were enemies in a time of war, yet they were treated better than many Americans outside the fence. Some guards were black soldiers from the segregated U.S. Army. For Germans raised on Nazi race laws, taking orders from a black man was unthinkable. A few even demanded transfers, requests that were calmly denied. Yet, when these same guards walked into town, some restaurants refused to serve them. The prisoners could sit inside, eat lunch, and enjoy coffee, while their guards, American citizens, had to use the side door. That contradiction didn't make sense to anyone. Out in the fields, the lines blurred even more. POWs picked cotton alongside Mexican American and black workers. They learned to share tools, trade jokes, and compete over who could fill sacks faster. One German later admitted that the experience broke something inside him, the idea that race determined a man's worth. The work itself was steady and organized. The prisoners noticed that American supervisors rarely shouted. Farmers gave clear directions. Then let people figure out the best way to finish the job. Efficiency came from trust, not fear. A strange idea for men trained in the discipline of the Wehrmacht. And everywhere there was conversation. Americans argued about politics, religion, and the war itself right in front of their prisoners. On one farm, a worker told a government inspector to go to hell over crop rules, and nothing happened to him. To the Germans, this was stunning. In their homeland, such defiance meant arrest or worse. In the camp itself, the Red Cross visited often, inspecting food, water, and medical care. Reports showed that German POWs were getting the same rations and health treatment as U.S. soldiers, sometimes even better. The food was plentiful, the hospital stocked with medicine, and the guards followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. All of this created quiet confusion. The prisoners began to debate among themselves. How could a country so loose, so full of argument and disorder, still be so strong? Slowly, they realized that strength didn't come from control. It came from freedom. By early 1944, conversations inside the camp had changed. The same men who once lectured others on Nazi discipline were now organizing study groups on democracy. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were learning how another kind of society worked, one where respect didn't have to be demanded, only shown. Camp Herne had started as a prison. It was becoming a classroom. When Germany finally surrendered in 1945, the men at Camp Herne waited to learn their fate. Many feared punishment or deportation to ruined cities. Instead, the Americans offered something else: education. The war was over, but the teaching wasn't. Classes expanded. Prisoners studied English, agriculture, and business. Professors from Texas colleges gave lectures on democracy and rebuilding. Thousands of Germans across America's 500 POW camps took part in the same programs. They learned how local government worked, how free markets operated, and how citizens could disagree without violence. At first, many didn't believe any of it would matter, But as news from home arrived, cities bombed, families starving, the lessons began to feel like preparation for a future they hadn't imagined. These students of freedom were being trained, quietly, to rebuild their country when they went home. Not all wanted to leave. Some had fallen in love with the open fields, the easy conversations, the rhythm of American life. After repatriation began, thousands applied to return. By the 1950s, around 5,000 former POWs had legally immigrated to the United States. Many became engineers, farmers, and teachers. Others stayed in Germany and helped shape the new democracy that would rise in the West. Records show how deep the change went. Surveys by occupation authorities found that nearly 3 out of 4 returning prisoners supported democratic reforms. Dozens became mayors, city council members, or business leaders. They brought home not just memories, but methods. Teamwork over hierarchy, trust over fear. In 1984, 40 years after their capture, former Camp Hearn prisoners came back to Texas for a reunion. They walked the same grounds, now quiet and overgrown. They hugged their old guards, shared photos of families, and laid flowers at the American Legion Memorial. One of them, Fritz Zimmerman, spoke for the group. "We came as enemies," he said, "and we left as students of freedom." History often measures victory in battles won and enemies defeated. But the story of the German POWs in America shows a different kind of power. The strength to turn enemies into allies through fairness, patience, and simple decency. America's greatest victory wasn't won overseas. It happened here, behind barbed wire, where freedom proved its worth by living up to its own ideals. If this story moved you, give it a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more untold stories that show how humanity can win, even without a single shot. Texas, 1944. The sun was still low when the truck stopped outside Amarillo, kicking up clouds of dry dust. Inside sat 24 German prisoners, young women in worn khaki uniforms, their faces pale from weeks of travel across the ocean. They had heard terrible things about America. That captured Germans were beaten, starved, even shot. None of them expected to survive the trip. When the back doors opened, the women braced for shouting and rifles. Instead, they heard a calm voice drawl, "Ma'am, watch your step." Standing in the light was a man in a sweat-stained hat, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dust on his boots. He didn't look like a guard. He looked like someone from an old movie. A cowboy. The air smelled of hay and horses, not fear. Around them stretched a horizon so wide it seemed to swallow the sky. A few soldiers leaned on their rifles, quiet, almost bored. One offered a tin cup of water. "Plenty more where that came from," he said. The women drank in silence, not sure if this was real. Among them was 24-year-old Liselott Minhart, a former radio operator from the Luftwaffe. She had been captured in France and shipped across the Atlantic. Back home, Nazi propaganda had painted America as a nation of criminals and machines, soulless, greedy, dangerous. But this didn't fit the picture. No shouting, no hate, just the sound of cicadas and the creak of saddles. The man in the hat pointed toward the stables. "You'll be helping out here, feeding, cleaning, maybe riding if you're up for it." The women stared at him, certain they misheard. Riding? Not digging trenches or scrubbing floors? For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the Americans smiled. "Come on, ladies. Horses don't bite if you're nice." The tension broke into nervous laughter. When the camp gates closed behind them, Liselott looked back at the endless plains. There were no guard towers, no barking dogs, just wind and light. she felt something she hadn't felt in months: curiosity. That night, sitting on a narrow bunk, she wrote her first note in English on a scrap of paper. "This is not what they told us." For women raised to believe that mercy was weakness, Texas was already rewriting the rules. They had expected chains. Instead, someone had handed them a saddle. The women had been told America would be a place of punishment. Instead, every day in Texas made less sense to them. At sunrise, they woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, not fear. Breakfast came on metal trays: eggs, bread, butter, sometimes even a slice of pie. Nobody yelled. Nobody hurried them. It felt wrong, almost suspicious, like a trick that never came. Whistle-Lot watched the Americans work. Cowboys moved with an easy rhythm, joking as they saddled horses or repaired fences. Even the soldiers guarding the ranch spoke politely, using please and thank you. For women raised in a world built on shouting and ranks, this calm confidence was hard to understand. The first time they were paid, a few paper coupons to spend at the camp store. They didn't know what to do. Cigarettes, chocolate, pencils, even postcards to send home lined the shelves. "They trust us with money?" one woman whispered. The clerk just smiled. "You earned it, ma'am." In Germany, authority came from fear. Here, it seemed to come from routine. Every job had a system: washing laundry, mending fences, cleaning stalls. Nothing was rushed, but everything got done. When Whistle-Lot asked a cowboy how they kept order without shouting, he shrugged. "You treat folks decent, they'll do the job." Letters from home made the difference even clearer. Friends wrote about bombings, hunger, and arrests for small complaints. In Texas, people argued about politics right in front of their prisoners. Farmers criticized Roosevelt. Workers debated war policy. To the German women, it was chaos, but a kind of organized chaos that worked. The food was another shock. Each prisoner received more calories than many civilians back home. Meat, vegetables, sugar, coffee. When Whistle-Lot hesitated over her plate, an American guard said kindly, "Eat up, you'll need it." She didn't know how to respond. Kindness from the enemy was something her country had never prepared her for. One afternoon, the women watched a cowboy toss a half-eaten apple into the dirt, then grab another from the barrel. None of them moved, but every eye followed that apple. In Germany, people were starving. Here, food was thrown away. It wasn't arrogance. It was abundance so casual it felt unreal. Bit by bit, fear gave way to disbelief, and disbelief turned into quiet admiration. America, they realized, didn't rule through terror. It ruled through structure and self-confidence. As Whistle-Lot wrote in her diary that night, "They win not because they are cruel, but because they don't have to be." The real surprise came a week later, when a pickup truck rolled into the yard loaded with saddles. The cowboy in charge, a tall man named Frank Callahan, called out, "All right, ladies, time to learn how to ride." The German women stared at him, sure he was joking. They were prisoners of war, not tourists. But he wasn't smiling like a man who made jokes. Frank explained through an interpreter that the ranch needed help moving cattle. "Can't herd cows on foot," he said. "You'll each have a horse. We'll show you the ropes." The women exchanged nervous looks. They'd been expecting handcuffs, not reins. The first lesson was chaos. One horse bolted, another refused to move, and one rider ended up face first in the dirt. The cowboys laughed, not cruelly, but kindly, and helped them back into the saddles. "Don't fight her," one drawled. "Just breathe. The horse will feel it." By the end of the morning, the women were covered in dust, sweat, and something new: laughter. For Whistle-Lot, The moment she felt the horse start to trust her was almost unreal. The animal's movement carried her forward across the open field, wind in her hair, no guards in sight. For the first time since capture, she felt motion that wasn't controlled by someone else. That afternoon, they ate together at a long wooden table. Cowboys passed biscuits and poured coffee without ceremony. Nobody barked orders. When a woman said thank you in broken English, Frank tipped his hat and replied, "You're welcome, ma'am." Simple words, but they landed deep. The work was hard, mending fences, carrying feed, cleaning stables, but it was honest. The cowboys treated them like extra hands, not like enemies. "You work, you eat. That's the deal," Frank said. And it was. Days passed into weeks. The trucks from the camp came only once to deliver supplies, and no one counted heads. The women could have tried to escape, but where would they go? Out there, the land stretched forever. Besides, for the first time, they didn't want to run. Each evening, the ranch gathered around a campfire. Someone played guitar. Others hummed along. One night, a cowboy started singing Lily Marlene. The Germans froze, then joined in. English and German voices blended under the same sky. The song of soldiers and sweethearts from opposite sides of a war. That night, Lieselot wrote in her notebook, "They trust us with horses. Maybe that is what freedom feels like." By the fall of 1944, life on the ranch had settled into a rhythm. The women worked from sunrise to sunset, feeding livestock, cooking, mending gear, and sometimes riding with the cowboys to move the herds. It was exhausting, but fair. And every evening, as the heat faded and crickets took over the silence, they sat outside the bunkhouse, watching the sky turn red over the plains. One morning, the camp officers handed out paper and envelopes. Each woman could write one letter home. The rules were clear. One page, no politics, and every word would be read by censors. Still, it was the first chance in months to reach their families. The bunkhouse that night was quiet, except for the scratch of pencils. Lieselot began slowly. "Dearest Mama, I am alive. You will not believe this, but I am in Texas. They call it a ranch. The people are kind." She paused, unsure how to describe what she saw every day. Men in wide-brimmed hats, fields full of cattle, laughter that came easily. She added, "They feed us well. They let us ride horses. I even drank something called Coca-Cola." Weeks later, the replies came back, full of disbelief. Her mother wrote, "Are you sure? It sounds like a dream. They must be tricking you." Lieselot smiled when she read it. How could she explain that kindness didn't always hide a trap? At the ranch, the lessons went far beyond work. The women watched how Americans treated one another, how a foreman could argue with his boss and not be punished, how a cowboy could speak freely to a soldier, how laughter always seemed to break tension. For Germans raised in a culture of rank and obedience, it was a new kind of order, one built on trust. Sometimes the cowboys teased them, gently but without cruelty. When a young woman struggled with her saddle, one said, "Don't worry, ma'am. You'll get it faster than most of our rookies." The tone made it clear. It wasn't mockery. It was equality. Evenings often ended by the fire. Guitars, harmonicas, and soft voices filled the night. One evening, a cowboy hummed Lily Marlene, and the women joined in again. No one planned it. No one spoke after. For a few minutes, the war seemed very far away. That night, Lieselot wrote another note she would never send. "They said we were enemies, but under these stars, I can't tell the difference." In Texas, she was learning something that couldn't be taught in any classroom. That peace doesn't start with treaties. It starts when people Stop acting like enemies. Spring, 1945. The wind on the Texas plains carried the smell of rain and new grass. Calves were being born, and the sky seemed endless again. But in the bunkhouse, a quiet unease grew. Rumors spread that Germany had fallen. Some said Hitler was dead. No one knew what to believe. One afternoon, Frank Callahan walked into the yard holding a folded newspaper. He took off his hat. "Ladies," he said softly, "it's over." For a moment, nobody moved. Then tools dropped, and someone began to cry. The women had imagined this day for years, but now that it was here, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like loss of a home that might no longer exist. That night, they sat by the fire in silence. Frank poured coffee and said, "You'll be going home soon." The word home hung heavy. What did home even mean after all this? Bombed cities? Empty streets? Families they might never find? A few weeks later, Army trucks arrived to take them back to camp for processing. The cowboys stood by as the women packed their things, mostly letters, small gifts, and photos. When Lizelot folded her work gloves into her bag, Frank walked over and handed her a small brown parcel. Inside was a cream-colored Stetson hat. "So you don't forget Texas," he said with a smile. She laughed through tears as the men cheered. As the trucks pulled away, the women looked out through the wooden slats at the waving hats and fading barns. For Lizelot, that image stayed burned in her memory. The moment she stopped being a prisoner and started being a person again. Months later, she stood on the ruined docks of Bremerhaven. Germany was rubble, yet in her bag, she still carried the hat, a symbol of something she couldn't quite name. Dignity, maybe, or hope. She found work as a translator for the Allied occupation forces. Her English full of cowboy slang and Texas drawl. Soldiers smiled when she called them partner. In 1948, she spoke at a women's conference in Stuttgart. "I was a prisoner of war," she told the crowd. "But I never felt like one. I learned that freedom isn't given by governments, it's given by people." Years later, she moved back to Texas, opening a small bakery in San Antonio. Above the counter hung a photo of her in that same hat beside Frank Callahan. The caption read, "From enemies to friends," because sometimes the strongest victories don't happen on battlefields. They happen when strangers choose decency over hate. If stories like this move you, give this one a like, share it with someone who loves history, and join us for more true tales of humanity that change the world. The Texas sun hit like a hammer. Heat shimmered across the flat horizon as a convoy of army trucks rolled to a stop on a dusty road outside a cattle ranch near Huntsville. The engines coughed, then went silent. Out of the back stepped a dozen German prisoners of war, blinking against the light. Their uniforms were faded, their faces drawn from months of travel, from battlefields in North Africa to ships across the Atlantic, to train cars that rattled deep into the American interior. They had been told to expect the worst. Nazi propaganda back home had painted a grim picture of America, a cruel, chaotic place where captured soldiers were beaten, starved, or forced into hard labor until they dropped. As one prisoner later wrote, "We imagined whips, not work gloves." But when the truck doors swung open, what they saw made no sense. No guard towers, no barking officers. Instead, a man in a wide-brimmed hat and dusty boots walked toward them with an easy stride. He had a rope slung over his shoulder and a smile that seemed too calm for war. Through a translator, he said, "You boys will be helping us on the ranch. Fences, cattle, whatever needs doing." The prisoners looked at one another in disbelief. This wasn't punishment. It sounded like a job. One young man from Bavaria whispered, They are letting us near animals, tools. Another just stared at the open fields stretching endlessly beneath the blue sky. Their new world smelled of hay and manure, not gunpowder. The air hummed with insects and the distant lowing of cattle. Cowboys leaned against fence posts, watching the newcomers with a mix of curiosity and caution. To them, the Germans looked more like farmhands than soldiers, tired, thin, and uncertain. By the end of that first day, the prisoners were issued water, food, and simple work clothes. Instead of chains, they were handed gloves and shovels. The foreman pointed to a broken fence line and gestured for them to follow. No shouting, no rifles aimed at their backs, just a quiet expectation to work. That night, as they sat in a makeshift barrack eating beef stew and cornbread, one prisoner muttered, "If this is captivity, then we misunderstood the war." Another nodded, "Maybe we misunderstood America too." For the first time since capture, they felt something unexpected, not fear, but confusion. The war had taught them to hate this place, yet under the Texas sun, surrounded by strangers who treated them like men instead of enemies, that hatred began to fade before they could even name it. By 1943, the United States had become the world's biggest warden. More than 400,000 Axis prisoners, most of them German, were scattered across the country. Texas alone held nearly 50,000, housed in dozens of camps built almost overnight. To many Texans, these new arrivals were a strange sight. German soldiers in dusty uniforms now filled the same landscape where cowboys and cotton pickers once worked. For the prisoners, the shock was even greater. They had expected barbed wire and brutality. What they found was organization and food. The rules came straight from the Geneva Convention, and the U.S. followed them with near obsession. Each prisoner received medical care, letters from home, and a daily ration that rivaled the diet of American soldiers, about 3,200 calories. There was bread, meat, potatoes, and sometimes even fruit. For men used to watery soup and ration cards, it felt unreal. ... This wasn't kindness for its own sake. It was strategy. A well-fed, occupied prisoner caused fewer problems. Bored men plotted escape. Busy men fixed fences. Every hour of work meant fewer guards, fewer fights, and more food for the home front. America turned captivity into efficiency. The same thinking shaped the labor system. With millions of American men overseas, farms and ranches were desperate for help. The army began loaning out prisoners to landowners for agricultural work. The ranchers paid the government, and the prisoners earned small allowances they could spend on cigarettes or candy in the camp store. For Texas ranchers, it was a simple exchange. For the Germans, it was something close to freedom. Conditions varied by camp, but the philosophy stayed the same. Control through decency. Guards were told to treat prisoners firmly but fairly. Abuse was forbidden. A soldier who respects himself respects his enemy, one U.S. officer explained. That attitude, quietly radical for wartime, set America apart from everything the prisoners had been taught to believe. Letters home were censored, but hints of disbelief slipped through. "We are treated better than at home." One man wrote, "We eat meat every day. The guards say please and thank you." To families still digging through rubble and rationing bread, those words sounded like fantasy. Yet in Texas, it was simply practical. Feed your workers and they'll work. Treat them with order and they'll obey. What the Germans couldn't see yet was the deeper truth. This quiet confidence, this belief that power didn't need cruelty, was America's most effective weapon of all. The first morning on the ranch began before sunrise. The air was cool, but the promise of heat already shimmered at the horizon. A cowboy named Earl Callahan, tall, sunburned, and unhurried, pointed to a stack of fence posts and said, "Start there." His tone was easy, not commanding, but the message was clear. Work mattered more than words. The German prisoners hesitated at first. They had been soldiers, not ranch hands. Their instinct was to wait for orders. To stand in neat lines, to salute. Earl laughed softly. "You don't have to stand at attention here, fellas. Just grab a hammer." That moment marked the beginning of a strange education. Texas ranching had its own rhythm. Fast, rough, and practical. Broken fences meant lost cattle. Delays cost money. Out here, discipline wasn't enforced by threat or rank, but by results. A cowboy's authority came from experience, not from stripes on his sleeve. At first, the work was exhausting. The sun baked their backs. The tools were heavy. The language barrier turned every instruction into pantomime. One prisoner swung a hammer so hard, the post cracked in two. Another accidentally startled a cow and was nearly trampled. The cowboys laughed, but not cruelly. They simply showed the right way to do it, then moved on. By the end of the week, something had changed. The Germans had stopped waiting for orders. They were moving with the flow of the work, fixing fences, hauling hay, driving cattle. Sweat replaced suspicion. The cowboys, in turn, began to see the prisoners less as enemies and more as willing hands who learned fast. One afternoon, a cattle drive tested everything they'd learned. Hundreds of longhorns had to be herded into pens before a storm rolled in. Dust filled the air. The cattle kicked and bellowed. The prisoners stumbled through the chaos, trying to keep up with the mounted cowboys who whistled and shouted commands they barely understood. But by the end of the day, the herd was safe. Everyone, cowboy and prisoner alike, was covered in dust and sweat, grinning with exhaustion. That night, the ranch hands lit a campfire. Someone pulled out a harmonica. The Americans sang country songs. The Germans, shy at first, joined with their own. Then one cowboy started humming Lili Marleen, a tune every German soldier knew. Within moments, the prisoners' voices rose softly into the night. Two languages, one melody. For a few minutes, the war seemed to vanish. There were no uniforms, no propaganda, no hate. Just men sharing music under the same Texas stars. From that point on, the work felt different. The Germans began to understand that the cowboys lived by a simple rule: respect the land, respect the job, respect each other. The cowboys didn't preach freedom, they lived it. They took orders from no officer, saluted no one, and yet everything around them functioned with quiet precision. It was a lesson no lecture could teach. The prisoners had grown up in a world where obedience was strength. Here, they learned that confidence could be calm, that power didn't have to shout. By the end of summer, even the locals had started calling them the German cowboys. It was half a joke, half a badge of honor. For the men who once fought under the swastika, it meant something more. It meant they were no longer defined by the war, but by the work. And in the heart of Texas, that was enough. By the end of that first year, the Germans had stopped counting the days. Work and weather had become their calendar. The camps still had fences, but on the ranches, the boundaries were invisible, and that was the strangest part of all. The prisoners could have run. The nearest town was miles away, the land open and endless. But where would they go? Across the dry plains, a man on foot wouldn't last long. Water was scarce, the distances too wide. And besides, no one wanted to run. For the first time in years, they were fed, trusted, and treated like human beings. The guards noticed it too. They stopped marching the men to the trucks at gunpoint. Instead, they leaned on the gates, talking about baseball or the weather, while the Germans loaded tools and feed sacks on their own. Discipline didn't vanish, it changed shape. The Americans' authority came not from fear, but from calm certainty that no one had a reason to rebel. That trust grew quietly, day by day. Ranchers began lending tools, even horses, to their German workers. Some prisoners were allowed to repair barns or milk cows without supervision. A few learned to drive pickup trucks between fields. It was freedom with an asterisk, one prisoner later recalled. We could see the road, we just didn't need to take it. At night, after long hours in the heat, the ranch hands and the Germans often gathered outside, sharing coffee or cigarettes. Conversations were slow and awkward at first, half gestures, half laughter. Then there were the small moments that chipped away at the wall between them. A cowboy slipped an extra biscuit to a homesick prisoner. A German fixed a saddle with improvised stitching that earned a nod of respect. One Sunday, the rancher's wife invited the men to listen to the radio from the porch. Country music, twanging and bright. The prisoners sat on the steps, grinning like kids. The locals noticed too. Farmers from nearby towns drove by just to stare. Those the Germans, one would ask? They look like regular fellas. In a way they were. Sunburned, calloused, laughing at jokes that barely translated. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in from the west. Lightning cracked over the hills, and the cattle panicked, scattering across the range. Without waiting for orders, the prisoners ran for the horses. Together with the cowboys, they rode into the downpour, shouting, waving, doing everything they could to corral the herd. It took hours of mud, rain, and pure grit, but by nightfall, every animal was back behind the fence. When it was over, everyone stood dripping by the barn. Soaked and smiling, the foreman clapped one prisoner on the shoulder and said, "Guess you boys are real Texans now." That night, the men painted a wooden sign and nailed it above their bunkhouse door. In crooked English, it read, "The German Cowboys." From that day forward, the name stuck. It wasn't irony anymore. It was identity. Somewhere between fences and freedom, captivity and trust, the Germans had learned the rhythm of Texas life. And the Texans had learned something too, that strength didn't always come from guns or guards, but from the quiet decision to believe in decency, even in wartime. Spring of 1945 came quietly to the Texas plains. The air smelled of rain and wild grass, and the war felt far away. Until one morning, a ranch truck pulled up with a newspaper on the seat. The headline was short and final: "Germany surrenders." Frank Callahan, the foreman, took off his hat when he told the men. "It's over," he said simply. No one cheered. The German prisoners stood silent, unsure what over really meant. For years, every moment of their lives had revolved around the war. Now the world had ended without an explosion, just a few quiet words on a page. That night, the ranch was still. The cowboys built a fire and the Germans sat nearby, staring into the flames. Some cried softly. Others just stared at the stars. One man whispered, "What do we go back to?" No one answered. Days later, army trucks arrived to take them away. They packed their few belongings, some letters, a belt buckle, a hand-carved trinket. When Lothar, one of the younger prisoners, climbed aboard, Frank handed him a small package. Inside was a cream-colored Stetson hat. "So you don't forget Texas," the rancher said. Lothar smiled through tears. "I won't." The road home was long. Ships crossed the Atlantic slowly, carrying men who were free, but not yet sure what that meant. When they finally reached Germany, the shock was overwhelming. Cities were gone, flattened, silent. Families were missing. Food was scarce. The men who had eaten steak and cornbread in Texas now stood in bread lines beside their mothers and sisters. One former prisoner wrote, "I left America a captive, and returned to Germany a beggar. But many also carried something unexpected, a sense of calm, a belief that another way of life was possible. They had seen it with their own eyes. Ordinary people working hard, respecting each other, laughing even in hard times. Some went back to farming, using American methods they had learned: crop rotation, efficient irrigation, better tools. Others became translators or mechanics for the Allied occupation. A few even returned to the United States years later as immigrants, starting new lives in the same state where they had once been held. For them, Texas wasn't just a place, it was a lesson. They had arrived believing that power came from fear. They left understanding that real power came from confidence, fairness, and trust. Decades later, historians would call it one of the quietest victories of World War II, a moral one. Without speeches or propaganda, America had shown its enemies the strength of its everyday life. And in small towns across Texas, old photos still hang in ranch houses. Sunburned men in cowboy hats, standing beside young Germans, all smiling, the war a shadow behind them. If you believe stories like this remind us what humanity can do, even in dark times, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because sometimes history's greatest lessons aren't about battles won, but about the people who chose decency instead of hate.
February 20th, 1943. North of the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, the desert was shaking with noise. Engines, gunfire, and dust. German tank crews watched something they could not explain. 5 American Sherman tanks were moving through the chaos as if one mind controlled them all. No flags, no flares, no messengers. They drove over broken ground, through smoke and shellfire with perfect timing. Every tank covered the other's blind spots. Every crew seemed to know exactly where the others were. German commanders were confused. Their own Panzer IVs had radios, but the sound was filled with static and crackling. Orders were lost in the noise. Many tanks could only listen. They couldn't talk back. When a command tank was hit, the whole unit went silent.
But the Americans, their voices came through clear as day. They talked, adjusted, warned each other, and attacked together. It looked almost supernatural. In reality, it was science. The kind of science born not on the battlefield, but in factories back home. Each Sherman carried something new, an FM radio set. Unlike the German AM radios that lost signal after a few hundred yards, the American system cut through the roar of engines and the desert static. Crews could talk clearly across miles. For the Germans, it broke every rule they had been taught. How could tanks without visual contact move in such perfect coordination? They didn't know that the Americans were using a completely different kind of communication, one the Wehrmacht didn't even realize existed. That morning at Kasserine, the world saw a new kind of power. It wasn't thicker armor or a bigger gun. It was invisible, a network of voices linking every American tank on the field. While German crews fought alone, shouting over engine noise and dust, the Americans fought connected. For the first time in history, tanks didn't just fight side by side. They fought together, as one machine, made of steel, men, and radio waves. The battle reports never captured that moment fully, but those who were there knew. Something new had arrived on the battlefield, something that would change how wars were fought forever. The story of this breakthrough didn't start in the desert. It began in a quiet factory building in Chicago, years before Kasserine. There, engineers from a small company called Galvin Manufacturing later known as Motorola, were trying to solve a problem that no one else could. The U.S. Army wanted radios that worked inside tanks, not the old kind that filled with static and failed when engines started, but something clear, strong, and reliable. Inside a tank, everything shakes, hums, and buzzes with electricity. For most radios, that meant chaos. Two men, Daniel Noble and Henryk Magnowski, found the answer. They used frequency modulation, or FM, instead of the older AM system used by most armies, including Germany's. FM filtered out the background noise and kept voices clean and steady, even during gunfire or over rough ground.
Their creation was called the SCR-508. It weighed about 180 pounds, packed with tubes, crystals, and precision wiring. But it could do something no other tank radio in the world could do. Let crews talk to each other in real time, clearly, across miles. Every Sherman tank that rolled out of Detroit carried this new technology. Each one became part of something far bigger, the first true battlefield network. For the first time, every tank could both send and receive. There were no silent partners anymore. Every crew had a voice. In November 1942, during Operation Torch in North Africa, that voice was heard for the first time in combat. American tanks moved with coordination that shocked even their own officers. Commands, warnings, and updates passed through the air instantly, cutting through the chaos of battle.
The Germans, still using short-range AM radios, had no idea what was happening. They thought the Americans had somehow mastered perfect discipline or drilled endlessly. They didn't yet understand that the real difference wasn't in training, it was in technology. From that moment, the game had changed. A war once fought with maps and shouted orders was turning into a war of communication, one where invisible signals could decide who lived and who didn't. The radio inside each Sherman was more than just equipment. It was a weapon, one that made every tank a thinking part of a larger machine. Together, they could move, react, and fight faster than anyone thought possible. And as those FM signals crossed the North African sky, the age of connected warfare had begun.
After North Africa, the lesson was clear. Radios could win battles. In Italy, that lesson became a revolution. The mountains there should have made radio use almost impossible. Signals bounced off rocks and vanished in valleys. But the American FM sets didn't quit. They kept working where the German AM radios fell silent. Tank crews who couldn't even see each other stayed connected through their headsets. They moved over ridges, through fog, and around enemy fire, talking the whole time. Orders came fast, clear, and alive. The Germans had to rely on visual signals, hand gestures, or flag codes, methods that belonged to another century. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the radio had become as important as the gun. But there was one big problem. Tanks and infantry couldn't talk directly. The soldiers on the ground used a different type of radio, tuned to another frequency.
This small gap cost lives. In the thick hedgerows of France, German soldiers with Panzerfausts could sneak close to American tanks while friendly infantry had no way to warn them. Something had to change, fast. American crews came up with a simple, genius fix. They took field telephones, the same kind used by the Signal Corps, and wired them to the outside of their tanks. A soldier could pick up the phone, call into the tank, and talk straight to the crew inside. It was crude, but it worked perfectly.
By late July, during Operation Cobra, communication between tank and infantry was seamless. The battlefield started to feel connected, alive, coordinated. Tanks, foot soldiers, artillery, and air support were now part of one voice. For the Germans, the change was shocking. They faced an army that seemed to know everything at once. Who was attacking? Where to strike? When to move? Their own tanks, even the mighty Panthers, fought almost blind. At Cobra, 200 Sherman tanks moved as if they were one giant machine. Radio chatter filled the air, short, fast, confident. Artillery responded in minutes, not hours. When one crew spotted danger, everyone knew it instantly. What had started as a technical upgrade was now a complete transformation. Radios weren't just helping communication, they were shaping the entire rhythm of battle. The war was no longer about who had the thickest armor. It was about who could talk, think, and act together.
It's one of the great ironies of the war. Germany, the nation that invented radio warfare, lost the battle for communication. Back in the 1920s, German officer Heinz Guderian had written that communication is the soul of armored warfare. He was right. But by 1943, most German tanks could barely talk to each other. Out of every 5 tanks, only 1 or 2 had full radios that could both send and receive. The rest could only listen. If the command tank was destroyed, the others were left blind and alone. The Americans were the complete opposite. Every single Sherman rolled out of the factory with a powerful FM radio. Motorola's plants in Chicago turned out tens of thousands of SCR 508 units. Each one had hundreds of parts built to survive dust, heat, and shock. Together, they formed the largest communication network ever seen on a battlefield.
That difference changed everything. In Italy, in France, in Germany itself, American tanks reacted faster, coordinated better, and adapted instantly. The Germans relied on rigid orders. The Americans could improvise because everyone, from the general to the driver, could talk in real time. During the Battle of Auercourt in September 1944, the 4th Armored Division faced German Panthers with thicker armor and deadlier guns. On paper, the Germans had every advantage, but radios turned the numbers upside down. American tankers shared enemy positions across the net within seconds. Artillery fire was called in minutes. Tank destroyers hit targets they couldn't even see, guided by radio reports. In 3 weeks, the Americans destroyed more than 200 German tanks while losing only a few dozen of their own.
The reason wasn't mystery or luck. It was communication. German commanders couldn't coordinate large attacks anymore. Their radios were too weak, their signals full of static, their systems too few. Many crews fought isolated battles, not knowing where allies or enemies were. Meanwhile, American units operated like one connected machine. If a tank was knocked out, the others instantly shifted to cover. If a bridge was found intact, word spread to every unit, within minutes. The Germans had better tanks, but the Americans had a better network. And in modern war, that makes all the difference. By the spring of 1945, the outcome was clear. German tanks were still powerful, but American tanks were connected. On the road to the Rhine, that difference decided the war. When U.S. forces reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, radio reports raced through the air. Within minutes, headquarters knew the bridge was still standing. Within an hour, reinforcements were on the move. American units from different divisions crossed and defended it together, all through radio coordination. The Germans tried to respond, but their phone lines were cut and their radios failed. Orders arrived too late. Across Europe, the same story repeated.
At the Ruhr pocket, hundreds of thousands of German troops were trapped because their communications collapsed. They couldn't talk to each other, couldn't plan a breakout, couldn't even call for help. Meanwhile, American columns advanced smoothly, guided by voices on the radio, voices that never stopped.
The difference wasn't only tactical, it was psychological. American crews knew they were never alone. Even when isolated in the fog or smoke, they could hear friendly voices. They could ask for help, warn others, or adjust the plan together. German crews fought in silence, each tank a lonely island. After the war, even German generals admitted what had happened. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel was said to remark, "We knew how to build better tanks, but you knew how to make them work together." Whether he said it or not, the truth stands. America didn't just build 49,000 Sherman tanks. It built 49,000 connected machines, each one a living part of a network. That network changed warfare forever. From the FM radios in Sherman tanks came the ideas behind today's digital battlefields. Modern armies still follow the same rule that was born in the North African desert. Connection means survival. The lesson is simple but powerful. In war, strength alone isn't enough. What matters most is how well you can share information, react, and move as one. The invisible signals that linked the Shermans did more than guide bullets. They guided victory. And that victory, born in static and steel, became the foundation of every connected army that followed. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment.
July 2nd, 1943. The sun burns over Sicily. A German Focke-Wulf fighter cuts through the sky above Castelvetrano airfield. Its pilot never sees the P-40 Warhawk diving from above until a burst of bullets rips through his wings. In seconds, the German plane spins down, trailing smoke, and crashes into the fields below. The man who fired those shots is First Lieutenant Charles Hall, 22 years old, from Brazil, Indiana. That afternoon, Hall becomes the first Black American pilot in history to shoot down an enemy aircraft. His victory will soon carry a symbol, a small painted swastika, under the cockpit of his plane. Proof that something impossible has just happened.
For years, the Nazis had preached that black people were less than human, unfit for complex machines, too weak for war. Their laws even banned marriages between Germans and people of African descent. In the world of Nazi ideology, a black pilot defeating a German ace was not only unthinkable, it was a direct hit to the foundation of their beliefs. But the truth was already rising above those same skies. Behind Hall stood hundreds of men from Tuskegee, Alabama, the first generation of black military pilots in U.S. history. They had faced barriers that most Americans could hardly imagine, denied entry to flight schools, rejected from combat, and told again and again that they simply could not fly. Yet they trained anyway, harder, longer, and with more to prove than anyone else.
In the months ahead, these men would be tested in the most dangerous missions of World War II, and they would pass every one. 15,000 sorties, over 1,500 missions, more than 100 enemy aircraft destroyed, and a bomber protection record better than any white fighter group in the same theater. Each victory tore another hole in the idea of racial superiority. Each flight proved that courage and skill know no color. But that day in Sicily, the moment Charles Hall's guns opened fire, was where the myth first began to fall. The world might not have noticed yet, but history had already changed direction. Long before Charles Hall pulled the trigger over Sicily, another kind of battle was already being fought, one on the ground, against racism at home. In 1925, the U.S. Army War College published a report that said black soldiers were of inferior mentality and lacked the courage for combat leadership. This was not just opinion, it was official military policy. Black Americans could drive trucks, dig trenches, or clean uniforms, but they could not fly. The idea of a black man commanding a fighter plane seemed laughable to those in power. Yet across the country, small groups of dreamers refused to accept that. Eugene Bullard, an American who could not serve in his own country, went to France and became the first black fighter pilot in World War I. Bessie Coleman, shut out of every American flight school, also traveled to France and earned her pilot's license in 1921. In Chicago, the Coffey School of Aeronautics began training young black men to fly, proving that skill had nothing to do with skin color. By the late 1930s, the world was heading toward war again. Civil rights leaders like Walter White, A. Philip Randolph, and Judge William H. Hastie pushed the government to open the skies to everyone. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier asked a simple question: how could America fight for freedom abroad while denying it to its own citizens? Under political pressure, Congress finally gave in. On April 3, 1939, Public Law 18 allowed one or more flight schools to train black pilots. It was a small, grudging step, but it cracked the door open. When Franklin Roosevelt ran for a third term, he needed black voters. On January 16, 1941, the War Department announced something that had never existed before: an all-black flying unit. It would be called the 99th Pursuit Squadron. But the announcement came with a warning. Officials described it as an experiment, as if they already expected it to fail.
Then came Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a quiet, disciplined officer who had survived 4 years of silence at West Point, where white cadets refused to speak to him outside of duty. Now, he was chosen to lead the experiment. 26 young pilots from Tuskegee, Alabama, would follow him into history. They trained in the Deep South, under the burning Alabama sun, in a country that still forced them to eat in separate cafeterias and sleep in separate barracks. But they didn't quit. Every takeoff was an act of defiance. Every landing was proof that they belonged in the sky. They were no longer asking for permission. They were preparing to fight for their country and for the right to be seen as equals.
In the spring of 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron arrived in North Africa. They were ready to fight, but their white commander, Colonel William Momier, did not believe they could. He gave them only patrol missions over the sea, no real combat, no chance to prove themselves. The men waited, trained, and listened to the sound of other squadrons flying to glory. Their first mission came on June 2, 1943. The Tuskegee pilots flew old P-40 Warhawks over the Italian island of Pantelleria. Suddenly, German fighters appeared, the sky filled with twisting trails of smoke and gunfire. The 99th held formation, protecting the bombers. No planes were lost. The battle ended in a draw, but it showed one thing clearly: these pilots would not panic under fire.
A month later came the day that changed everything. July 2nd, 1943. Charles Hall was flying his 8th mission, escorting bombers over Sicily. 2 German Focke-Wulf 190s moved in for the kill. Hall turned his plane sharply, got behind one, and fired a long burst. The German fighter rolled and went straight into the ground.
When Hall landed, the base erupted in cheers. Black ground crews who had endured months of insults finally had their answer. That kill was more than a victory. It was proof. The experiment had succeeded. But respect was slow to come. By early 1944, Colonel Momier sent a harsh report to Washington claiming that the 99th lacked aggressiveness and should be pulled from combat. The War Department began to consider ending the program. Then came Anzio. On January 27, 1944, German planes attacked Allied ships and troops near the beachhead. 15 pilots from the 99th took off in their worn P-40s to meet the enemy. The Germans flew faster, newer Focke-Wulfs, but this time it didn't matter. The Tuskegee pilots fought with skill and calm precision. In 2 days, they shot down up to 13 enemy planes.
The victory stunned everyone. Washington ordered a review comparing the 99th with white squadrons. The results showed no difference in performance except one. The Tuskegee pilots had fought longer, harder, and with fewer resources. The battle at Anzio silenced the doubters. The men from Tuskegee had proven they could do more than just fly. They could win. Now the military could no longer hide them in the shadows. The next chapter would take them higher, into the skies of Europe, where they would become known by a new name, the Red Tails. In the spring of 1944, the Tuskegee pilots were no longer an experiment. They were the heart of a new unit, the 332nd Fighter Group. 4 squadrons came together under one commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Their mission was simple but critical: protect the big, slow bombers flying deep into enemy territory. Before every flight, Davis gave the same order: "Our job is not to be aces. Our job is to bring those bombers home." That idea became their rule. While other fighter pilots sometimes chased easy kills, the Red Tails stayed close to the bombers, no matter what. In June 1944, the Air Force gave every fighter group its own color marking. The 332nd painted the tails of their P-51 Mustangs bright red. From then on, bomber crews began to recognize them instantly. They didn't know the pilots were black. They only knew these escorts never abandoned them. Word spread quickly through the bomber units: if you can get the Red Tails, you're going to make it home. Their biggest test came on July 18, 1944. 66 Red Tails flew into Germany to meet bombers heading for a Luftwaffe base at Memmingen. The bombers arrived late. Davis had a choice: turn back or wait inside enemy airspace. He decided to stay. Moments later, almost 100 German fighters attacked. For 20 fierce minutes, the sky became chaos. The Red Tails fought outnumbered, protecting the bombers while dodging enemy fire from every direction. When it was over, 15 bombers had been lost, but the rest made it home. The Red Tails claimed 11 German kills that day, though they lost 3 of their own. Analysts later said Davis's decision had prevented a total disaster. By early 1945, the Red Tails were flying long missions across all of Europe. On March 24th, they faced a new and terrifying threat: the German jet, the Me-262. It could fly faster than any propeller plane on Earth. That morning, 43 Red Tails escorted bombers to Berlin. As the jets attacked, Lieutenant Roscoe Brown spotted one diving ahead. He climbed fast, fired 3 bursts, and watched the jet pilot bail out. 2 more Tuskegee pilots, Earl Lane and Charles Brantley, each shot down a jet that same day. 3 Me-262s destroyed in one battle. It was a record no other American group had ever matched. That mission earned the Red Tails a Distinguished Unit citation. More than that, it earned them something far greater: the respect of everyone who had ever doubted them.
Not every mission ended in victory. Some Red Tails were shot down and captured. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson was one of them. His plane was hit over southern France in 1944. When the Germans took him prisoner, he expected the worst. But in the POW camp, something unexpected happened. He was treated like every other captured American officer. White prisoners, many of them bomber crews, often came up to thank him. "You guys saved us," they told him. For Jefferson, the irony was painful. In a Nazi prison, he was treated more equally than in his own country.
While the Germans knew exactly who the Red Tails were, many Americans still didn't. The Luftwaffe even had a name for them: Schwarze Vogelmännchen, Black Birdmen. In Germany, their reputation grew. In America, their achievements were often hidden or ignored. The War Department rarely talked about their success. In the segregated United States, the idea of black pilots outperforming white ones made too many people uncomfortable. But the bomber crews knew the truth. They called them Red Tail Angels. To those men, race didn't matter, only survival did. And the numbers backed it up. Bombers escorted by the Red Tails lost fewer planes than with any other fighter group. They flew more than 15,000 missions, destroyed over 100 enemy aircraft in the air, and hundreds more on the ground. Their record was unmatched. When the war ended, most Tuskegee Airmen came home quietly. There were no parades, no TV interviews. Many could not even get jobs as commercial pilots. Some were told to their faces that America wasn't ready for a black man in the cockpit. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had led them with calm determination, stayed in the Air Force. In 1954, he became the first black general in U.S. Air Force history. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed the order that finally ended segregation in the military. His decision was shaped in part by the proof the Red Tails had given, that discipline, courage, and excellence have no color. Recognition came slowly. Decades later, in 2007, President George W. Bush awarded the Tuskegee Airmen the Congressional Gold Medal. Only about 300 of the original men lived to see it. Their story is no myth. It's written in numbers, in courage, and in the skies of Europe. 112 enemy planes destroyed in air combat. 3 German jets shot down in one day. 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses awarded. As Tuskegee Airman pilot Roscoe Brown said, "We didn't just fight the Germans. We fought ignorance, prejudice, and hatred. And we won all 3. The Tuskegee Airmen changed history, proving that when given the chance, greatness always rises." Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, leave a comment, and check out more amazing history on our channel. February 20th, 1943, north of Kasserine Pass. German tank commanders watched something that made no sense. Through dust and smoke, 5 American Sherman tanks moved across broken ground, together as if one machine. They had no visual contact, no flag signals, no messengers. Yet every turn, every shot, every move was in perfect rhythm. To the Germans, it looked like chaos with a strange kind of order inside it. Their own panzers tried to keep up. Commanders shouted into radios filled with static. Orders came half heard, half lost. The signal broke every few hundred yards. In the heat of battle, it meant silence. German tanks used amplitude-modulated radios, AM, a system that turned every spark, every engine noise, every gunfire into interference. Their transmitters were weak, 10 watts of power, barely enough to reach across a small valley. Many tanks didn't even have transmitters, only receivers. They could listen, but never answer.
When one Sherman was hit, another instantly shifted position to cover it. When smoke blocked the view, radio guided them. They didn't guess where to move, they knew. What the Germans didn't realize was that this invisible connection, those unseen radio waves, were more powerful than armor or firepower. At Kasserine Pass, the Americans lost the battle on the ground, but revealed something far bigger, a new way to fight a war. They had built not just tanks, but a network.
The story of America's secret advantage didn't begin on the battlefield. It began in a lab, inside a small company in Chicago called the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation. Later, the world would know it as Motorola. In 1941, while German armies pushed deep into the Soviet Union, American engineers were fighting a different kind of battle, against noise, vibration, and bad connections. Radios in tanks often failed. Engines drowned out voices. Static made commands impossible to hear. An engineer named Daniel Noble had an idea. Use frequency modulation, FM, instead of AM. It was cleaner, stronger, and harder to jam. His colleague, Henrik Magnuski, figured out how to make it work inside a tank. That was not easy. Tanks were hot, cramped, and full of metal that blocked signals, but they made it work. Their radio, the SCR 508, weighed about 180 pounds. It was heavy, but it turned every tank into a talking machine. Commanders could choose from 10 preset channels, switch quickly, and stay connected even in chaos. Each set had 2 receivers, so crews could listen to both company and platoon channels at once, something no German tank could do. By July of 1941, the U.S. Army standardized the SCR 508 for all medium tanks. Every Sherman coming off the line in Detroit carried one. From that moment, American tanks were no longer just vehicles. They were part of a living network.
When the first Shermans rolled into North Africa in late 1942, the difference became clear. German commanders saw tanks that seemed to think together. They didn't know it was because of the radio sets inside. That invisible system connected crews who had never met. It turned hundreds of tanks into one coordinated force, and that changed everything about how America fought. Blueprints couldn't show it. Training manuals didn't name it, but it was there, a silent thread running through steel and static, holding every Sherman together. The power wasn't in thicker armor or a bigger gun. It was in the ability to talk and to listen.
At first, even the Americans didn't realize what they had. Their new radios didn't just send messages, they changed how people fought. In North Africa, the Germans won the early battles. Their tanks had thicker armor and better guns. But during the fight at Kasserine Pass, American crews started to see something the Germans couldn't: each other. Through their radios, they warned of ambushes, shared targets, and called for help. Units spread across 50 miles, fought like they were side by side. German officers listening in were shocked. They could hear every word, clear and strong, while their radios hissed and popped. They wrote reports calling the American communication unnatural. They didn't understand it was technology, not luck.
When American forces moved into Italy in 1943, radios became even more important. Mountains made it impossible to see other tanks or wave signals. But FM radios worked where sight and sound failed. Crews could coordinate from one valley to the next, like invisible hands guiding each other through the fog. Then came Normandy, D-Day. Sherman tanks rolled off landing craft with their radios already tuned to talk with naval gunfire and aircraft overhead. For the first time, land, sea, and air could move as one team. But soon they hit a new problem. Tanks and infantry couldn't talk directly. The soldiers' radios used different frequencies.
In the hedgerows of France, that gap was deadly. German soldiers with Panzerfausts could sneak close, while nearby American infantry had no way to warn the tanks. Crews found a simple fix. They bolted field telephones to the back of their tanks, wired straight to the intercom. A soldier could pick up the phone, yell "enemy ahead," and the gunner would fire in seconds. By the summer of 1944, this mix of smart engineering and quick thinking turned chaos into coordination. During Operation Cobra, hundreds of Sherman tanks moved like one machine. A single radio call could shift an entire attack. Artillery answered within minutes. The battlefield had changed. America wasn't just fighting battles anymore, it was orchestrating them. By 1944, the secret of America's success was no longer a mystery to its own soldiers. Every tank crew knew that the radio was their real weapon. Factories across the country worked non-stop to build them. In Chicago, Motorola turned from making car radios to producing thousands of SCR 508 sets for the Army. Each one had over 2,000 tiny parts, wires, tubes, and crystals built to survive heat, shock, and dust. By the end of the war, more than 50,000 radios had been made, enough for every single Sherman tank ever built. The result was total communication. Commanders didn't need to shout orders or send runners. They could create new battle groups on the move, mixing tanks, infantry, and artillery, and know everyone could talk instantly. It made the American Army flexible in a way the Germans couldn't imagine.
German units still relied on visual signals and strict hierarchy. Only a few of their tanks had full radio sets, so when a command tank was hit, the rest went silent. Their famous Panthers and Tigers had power, but not connection. The difference became clear in the Battle of Aracourt in September 1944. American Shermans faced the German Panthers, faster, stronger, deadlier. On paper, the Germans should have crushed them, but the Americans fought as a network. Every tank reported enemy positions in real time. Artillery responded within minutes. Tank destroyers struck from hidden spots, guided by radio calls. In 3 weeks, the 4th Armored Division destroyed nearly 300 German tanks and lost only 41 of its own, a 7-to-1 ratio that no one had thought possible. It wasn't luck. It wasn't better armor. It was communication.
While Germany built better tanks, America built better teamwork. While they trusted steel, America trusted the signal. The invisible network that started with one radio model had become a weapon more powerful than any gun. And it was only the beginning.
By 1945, the power of connection reached its peak. When American troops reached the Rhine River, their radios turned chaos into control. At the Bridge of Remagen, a single message sent by radio changed the course of the war. Within minutes, commanders hundreds of miles away knew the bridge was still standing. Within an hour, whole divisions were moving to seize it. The Germans couldn't react. Their phone lines were bombed, their radios weak and full of static. Orders came too late. At the same time, American tanks from different units talked freely, sharing positions and targets as if they were one team.
Soon after, in the Ruhr pocket, 300,000 German troops were trapped. Their lines of communication had collapsed. They fought bravely, but without coordination, every battle turned into confusion. American air and ground units, linked by radio, closed the trap tighter every hour.
When the war ended, Allied engineers studied captured German tanks. What they found was shocking. The technology inside was 5 years behind. German radios were fragile, unstable, and easily jammed. The Americans had moved into a new age without even realizing it. That invisible leap changed warfare forever. The same ideas that powered the SCR-508 lived on in every tank and aircraft that came after it, from the Cold War to the Gulf War, from analog waves to digital signals. Modern armies still followed the same rule that was born on those dusty fields in North Africa. Communication beats armor.
Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel is said to have summed it up at Germany's surrender. "You built better teamwork. We built better tanks." True or not, the words capture what happened. America didn't just make 49,000 Shermans. It made 49,000 connected machines, the first battlefield network in history. From that moment on, the strongest weapon was not steel or firepower. It was the ability to stay connected. Connection means survival. Isolation means defeat. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment.
July 2nd, 1943. Sicily. A German fighter streaks through the hot Mediterranean sky. The pilot doesn't see the American plane diving behind him until gunfire tears through his engine. A second later, the Focke-Wulf explodes. The man behind the trigger is First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall, 22 years old, from Brazil, Indiana. He's flying a P-40 Warhawk, and what he's just done is something German commanders said could never happen. A black pilot has shot down one of their best. When Hall lands, the airfield erupts. Mechanics and ground crew rush toward him, shouting, laughing, crying. For months they've faced insults and doubt. Now they have proof, not just that they belong, but that they can win. That day, a small swastika was painted on Hall's aircraft, marking the first confirmed kill by a black American pilot in history. It would be the first of many. Before the war's end, these pilots would destroy more than 100 German planes and earn the nickname Schwarze Vogelmenschen, the Black Bird Men. To the Nazis, this was impossible. Their racist ideology called black people subhuman, too weak and unintelligent for complex machines or combat. But in the blue skies over Europe, those theories began to burn away like vapor trails. What the Germans didn't know was that Hall and his fellow pilots came from a place called Tuskegee, Alabama, a flight program the U.S. military once labeled an experiment. They were trained longer, pushed harder, and judged more harshly than anyone else. Every mission carried 2 battles, one against the enemy and one against prejudice. Their story wasn't just about flying. It was about proving, in the most dangerous way possible, that courage and skill have no color. The first victory over Sicily wasn't only a win in the air. It was the moment a nation's own lie began to crack. And soon, the skies over Europe would never look the same again. Long before Charles Hall flew over Sicily, another battle had already begun, the fight to let black Americans fly at all. In 1925, the U.S. Army War College wrote a report that said black soldiers were inferior in mentality and lacked courage for leadership. It was official policy, printed in government papers. Those words slammed doors before they even opened. But a few people refused to accept it. Eugene Bullard left America to fly for France in World War I because his own country wouldn't let him serve. Bessie Coleman went to France too, earning her pilot's license in 1921 when no U.S. flight school would take her. They proved what the system tried to deny, that talent has no color.
By the 1930s, small flying schools for black students appeared in cities like Chicago. The Coffee School of Aeronautics trained dozens of skilled pilots, showing everyone that aviation wasn't just for whites.
As war clouds grew over Europe, pressure for change built up at home. Civil rights leaders like Walter White, A. Philip Randolph, and Judge William H. Hastie pushed President Roosevelt to open the skies. Black newspapers asked a question America couldn't ignore. How can we fight for democracy abroad while denying it at home? In 1939, Congress passed Public Law 18. Hidden inside was one small line, a requirement to train black pilots in at least one civilian flight school. It was a small opening, but it was enough.
2 years later, on January 16, 1941, the War Department announced the creation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit. Officially, it was an experiment to see if black men could be trained for combat. Behind that cold phrase stood real people with real dreams. Young men from Alabama, Ohio, New York, and every corner of the country. They knew what the world thought of them, and they came to prove it wrong.
At Tuskegee, Alabama, they began their training. Long hours, endless drills, no mercy for mistakes. It wasn't just about learning to fly. It was about earning the right to be called American pilots. They called it an experiment. The men of Tuskegee called it a mission.
In the spring of 1943, the 99th Fighter Squadron left Alabama and crossed the ocean. They landed in North Africa, a world away from home, and stepped into a war that doubted them before they even took off. Their commander, Colonel William Mommier, didn't believe black pilots could fight. He gave them simple patrols over the sea, far from real combat. It was meant to make them fail quietly, but they didn't. Their first mission came on June 2nd, over the island of Pantelleria. German planes appeared suddenly, diving through the clouds. The Tuskegee pilots held formation, protecting the bombers they escorted. No planes were lost, no one broke ranks. It wasn't a victory on paper, but it was proof. They could stand the pressure. A month later, everything changed. July 2nd, 1943. Charles Hall's victory over Sicily. The news raced through the unit. Cheers, tears, disbelief. One man's kill became a symbol for thousands who had waited their whole lives to be seen. But not everyone celebrated. Back in Washington, Colonel Mommier wrote a report claiming the 99th lacked aggressiveness and should be removed from combat. It was the excuse critics were waiting for. Then came Anzio, January 27, 1944. 15 Tuskegee pilots took off in their worn-out P-40s to protect Allied troops on the beach. The sky filled with German fighters. What followed was chaos. But when it cleared, the 99th had shot down multiple enemy planes. Some reports said 8, others said 13. It didn't matter. What mattered was this: they had done what no one believed they could. Their courage silenced the doubters. A War Department study compared their results with white squadrons and found no difference in performance. After Anzio, everything shifted. The 99th was joined by 3 more all-black squadrons: the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd. Together, they formed the 332nd Fighter Group. The experiment was over. The legend was about to begin. By mid-1944, the pilots from Tuskegee had a new name and a new mission. They were now the 332nd Fighter Group, and their planes had bright red tails. The color made them easy to spot in the sky.
Soon, bomber crews started asking for them by name. "Get us the Red Tails." Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. gathered his men on the dusty airfield at Ramatelli, Italy. He gave them one rule: "We are not here to chase glory. We are here to bring the bombers home." That idea became their code. While other groups sometimes broke formation to hunt easy kills, the Red Tails stayed tight, guarding their bombers until the job was done.
Their first big test came on July 18, 1944. 66 Mustangs met hundreds of German fighters over southern Germany. The air was full of smoke, fire, and confusion. 15 bombers went down. 3 Red Tail pilots were lost, but without their protection, the whole mission might have collapsed. Even critics had to admit it. These men had faced impossible odds and held the line. By early 1945, the German Air Force was collapsing, but it still had one last weapon, the Me-262 jet, the fastest plane in the world. No propeller fighter could match its speed.
On March 24th, the Red Tails flew their toughest mission yet, escorting bombers to Berlin. As they neared the city, the German jets attacked. But the Red Tails had studied their enemy. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown turned into a jet's blind spot and fired 3 long bursts. The jet exploded in midair. 2 more followed, shot down by Earl Lane and Charles Brantley. 3 jets destroyed, more than most fighter groups took down during the whole war. When the Red Tails landed, cheers filled the base. They had just done what many thought was impossible. Their bright red tails had become more than a color. They were a promise that no bomber would be left alone and no prejudice could hold them down.
When the war ended in 1945, the Red Tails came home as heroes, but America didn't see them that way yet. At the docks, they were still told to stand in separate lines, to use separate bathrooms, to go back to a country that hadn't changed as much as they had. For years, their story was mostly forgotten. White bomber crews never forgot. They called them the Red Tail Angels, but history books rarely mentioned their name. Many Tuskegee Airmen kept quiet, tired of being questioned or doubted. "Nobody believed me anyway," Pilot Lee Archer once said. "A black fighter ace? They thought I was lying." But their record spoke louder than any prejudice. 15,000 combat missions, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, 27 bombers lost to enemy fire, about half the losses of other units, 96 distinguished flying crosses. They had turned an experiment into one of the best fighter groups in the entire U.S. Air Force. Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who once endured silence at West Point, became America's first black general. Others went on to careers in business, education, and public service. They had carried a country's doubt on their backs and turned it into pride. Recognition came slowly. Decades later, in 2007, surviving airmen stood in the U.S. Capitol as they received the Congressional Gold Medal. Many were in their 80s. Some cried quietly as the applause filled the hall. Roscoe Brown summed it up best. "We didn't just fight the Germans. We fought ignorance, prejudice, and hatred, and we won all 3. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't just make history. They changed what America believed was possible. If stories like this move you, share them, subscribe, leave a comment, and help keep their legacy flying.